Torna Fem Ciència, una sèrie per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Aquesta 5a temporada està dedicada a les ciències quàntiques. Avui parlarem amb Margriet van der Heijden, professora i investigadora en física de partícules i comunicació científica a la Universitat Tècnica d'Eindhoven, als Països Baixos. Escriu sovint al diari holandès NRC i és l'autora de diversos llibres infantils i també del llibre Ongenken sobre dones a la història de la física. Forma part del grup Women in the History of Quantum Physics i és una de les editores del volum sobre dones en la mecànica quàntica que es publicarà el juliol de 2025. És la història de la ciència sexista?
Well, I'm not sure it's truly sexist in the sense that sexist sounds as a very, to me at least, as a very active act of excluding or stereotyping people or genders. But I do think it's very gendered, although probably over the last decades progress has been made. In our book, in the introduction, we quote Massimiliano Badino, but he noticed that the perspective in the history of science and especially in physics is still very gendered indeed.
L'any 2025 ha estat declarat l'Any Internacional de les Ciències i les Tecnologies Quàntiques. Què en penses de les commemoracions científiques i en particular d'aquesta?
I have been working for a long time also as a science journalist, and as a journalist you're always interested in the news and you do not like so much everything that's on the calendar. And commemorations more in general are of course sometimes also occasions in which the existing power balances or the existing ideas are being reinforced. You asked me explicitly about the commemoration of 100 years of quantum with the editors of the book and authors of chapters. We were at the World Meeting of the American Physical Society, but we were also at the spring meeting of the Deutsche Physikalische Gesellschaft. And both meetings were also used to commemorate 100 years of quantum mechanics. Yeah, it was striking for me to what extent indeed the talks that were given were still confirming this rather stereotypical idea that quantum physics is, or quantum mechanics especially, is the result of a knabenphysiek, of the work of young men that were very brilliant, very young, and extremely smart. In Göttingen, at the meeting of the Deutsche Physikalische Gesellschaft, I think in none of the meetings, except for our session, contributions of women were mentioned, for example.
La física quàntica està mitificada com un pensament masculí, però realment quin paper van tenir les dones en el desenvolupament de la física quàntica durant el segle XX?
If you think about progress in the sciences, people very often describe it in terms of scientific heroes that stand upon the shoulders of one another. And you have this like a ladder of all these giants standing on one another's shoulders. Whereas in reality, I think it's a mountain range, and you have people conducting experiments, you have teachers, educators, people communicating, all sorts of researchers, and then on top you have these very few people that do very creative work. And what you see at the beginning of the 20th century is that women are on the lower, they are sustaining the tops. They are within the mountain range, but at a slightly lower levels, and part of sometimes what Stephen Shepard called the invisible hand. And for example, in my country, in the Netherlands, it's really interesting to see that this first generation of women entering the universities was very interested in the sciences. So half of them opted for a study in the sciences. And within physics, about 30%, 25 to 30% of the students were women students in the first decade of the 20th century. Everything is new to them, and it's not trivial. There's this boys' network. So if they're lucky, they have a mentor or a husband or someone that is believing in them. But it's almost impossible then for them to take part in this revolution. In the Netherlands, for example, we had Jo van Leeuwen, who showed that magnetism cannot be explained from a classical point of view, which is a kind of an indication that there should be something else. So quantum theory, Bohr, in fact, independently and just before her, found the same result. But what you see is that Bohr became very successful, and she found the same result. In fact, her work was way more comprehensive, but she got stuck in a position at a university which was rather subservient, or so she was responsible for the practicals for students with hardly any time to be creative.
On dibuixes la línia entre la recuperació històrica i la heroificació de figures femenines com a casos excepcionals?
What you want ideally is to give a kind of balanced view of history, which is of course impossible. During the several sessions that we had presenting chapters from our book, the question you just asked popped up in different forms. For example, in Barcelona, it's not necessary to write all these biographies. Wouldn't it be better to look at him with a more meta view, networks between women, networks between where they, from the risk of making heroines out of the women that did contribute to physics and science, because I think that's not the idea. These were human beings with flaws and talents and excellent points, just like we all have. I myself, I don't know if I have time, but I would really like to look to the networks between women working in the field of quantum at the beginning of the 20th century, for example. Did they get in touch? And it would be interesting to look into rivalry perhaps between women. There are many aspects that one could think about.
Com interpretes l'espai domèstic en la vida de Tatiana Afanassjewa Ehrenfest?
Throughout the life of Afanassjewa, there were various stages. So she was raised in a rather traditional way in St. Petersburg. When she met her future husband, Paul Ehrenfest, they promised one another that they would always keep on studying and working together. So what really brought them together was their love for the sciences. They were not alone in doing so, because I think, like, if you look at the life of Einstein and Mileva Maric, they also made a promise like that. Of the lives of these couples show is how difficult it was to stick to that promise in a society that has ideas that are so different. At first, in Vienna, when they had their first daughter, they were still studying and working together. Also, when they moved to Göttingen, and then when they moved to Petersburg. But here in Petersburg, Ehrenfest became very unhappy because he couldn't find a position, which was partly also due, I think, to anti-Semitism, to the fact that they had to renounce their religion in order to be able to marry, to the fact that they had quite progressive ideas in other fields as well. But Afanassjewa was the one that provided them with an income. She was also the richest of the two. And then in Leiden, their roles completely reversed. So it was Ehrenfest who got a position as a professor. And in the Netherlands, in those years in the 20th century, the Netherlands was very conservative, has always been, if you look at gender specifically, quite conservative, still is, I think. But in the Netherlands, women usually did not hold a position, and especially not an academic position, but they did not, once they were married, they would traditionally stay at home and take care of the house and of the children. And Afanassjewa was struggling with that, so she was traveling back to Russia and to participate in congresses and debates there. But it was also to escape, I think, from from this life in Leiden that really sometimes felt a bit as a prison to her. And perhaps about the household, she didn't like cooking at all, and she never cooked. She always ordered meals. And in the end, their home became like an oasis, a meeting place for scientists all over the world, and that's what she created together with Ehrenfest. But so it was mixed. It was a household that she was maintaining. It was a house that she opened up to people and to ideas.
Quin impacte creus que tindrà el llibre que properament sortirà publicat, Woman in the History of Quantum Physics?
I think with a lot of pleasure and energy and inspiration. At least that's how I felt it. I really felt privileged to work on this project, and I've learned so much from all the participants. And hopefully that has resulted in a book that indeed can make impact, that can show that there were women contributing to quantum development, and in important manners, like Pickering series, but also think about a Laura Chalk, or think about a Lucy Mensing, and think about your chapter of Anna Maria Chetto, who has played an enormously important role, I think, in more recent quantum developments. And not only that, I hope that the book can also show the mechanisms sometimes holding these women back from fully deploying their talents, and learn from that, and perhaps learn how to prevent hindering people from developing all their talents in the future, or and that we can perhaps learn from that to help creating a more level playing field for as many people as possible. But whether the book will truly have such an impact, that is, it will now go out in the world, and we have to see how the world will receive it.
Danke je, Margriet. Ens veiem en la propera entrevista d'aquí 2 dijous. Fins aviat!